Ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to many of our friends and newcomers to the Baker Institute for what I think will be another very special event this evening. We are marking, unfortunately, the occasion of the close of this wonderful exhibit that's been here for a month now, and that we've had the privilege to host on the American presidency. Time and the Presidency retells our most recent history of our presidents through the pages of Time magazine's coverage. We want to recognize and thank the efforts of Time Warner AOL for their efforts in mounting this traveling exhibit. And as I said when we opened it, I think there's only been 7 stops, and we are the last stop of this exhibit in the nation, and for including the Baker Institute in this national tour. We also wish to thank the American Century Fund for their financial support of the exhibit and its tour. Many of you were here 2 weeks ago when Secretary Baker and the Institute hosted UCITE, who wrote the text associated with these pictures that you see in the exhibit. And we had a wonderful evening of UCITE's reflections on the office and those who have filled it. And of course, Mr. Baker gave a very insightful presentation on the need for civility in our political life today. Tonight, the Institute hosts a distinguished panel of scholars to take us through from that past that time has captured to the future of the presidency, which is unfolding before our very eyes. As you know, for the past, at least some of you know, for the past 18 months, the Baker Institute has been an important component of what is called the White House 2001 project. Professor Terry Sullivan from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and who is the Thomas Cook and Mary Elizabeth Edwards Fellow in American Government and Democracy at the Baker Institute, has worked here preparing what I think are some of the most important and informative briefing materials ever provided to smooth the way for the new president's White House. In addition, the Baker Institute has supported the development of very innovative software that helps presidential nominees file the burdensome forms they must do as part of the appointments process. Having been a victim of that process for 3 times, I can tell you that after being in the government for some 34 years, and you get a form when your next presidential appointment is going underway, and it says, what was your father's name? What was your mother's maiden name? Where did you live since before you were born? It gets cumbersome. And our people have taken a hard, cold look at this, and they've come up with some very, very efficient and I think appropriate remedies to this burdensome process. Terry Sullivan, as you know, is an expert on presidential legislative leadership, and while he has been with us, has also been preparing a book on presidential management and legislative leadership. He is a past president of the American Political Science Association's Presidency Research Group. So let me reintroduce Terry, and we can hear about the project, and he will introduce our panelists and moderate the discussion. Join me in welcoming Terry Sullivan.
Thank you, Ambassador Derision. Welcome, everybody, again to another White House 2001 project activity. As Ambassador just noted, tonight's panel marked the beginning of a new administration by considering the history and practice of presidential transitions. And it's really neat. We have a group of the best scholarly minds on this subject. As I noted in November's roundtable event on the transition planning, the Baker Institute has played an important role in preparing the way for the new administration, our efforts dating back originally to August of 1999. The White House 2001 project, housed here at the Baker Institute and at its offices in Washington, has worked to underscore the importance of a bipartisan approach to the presidential transition. In addition to building this common ground on transition planning, the White House 2001 project has played an exceptionally important role in providing a much-needed institutional memory for 7 critical White House offices. The Baker Institute's Washington Forum on the White House Chief of Staffs this past June played a significant role in both the process of shaping public opinion and acceptance of transition planning, and in fact providing valuable information to the transition planners. Recently, the Bush Transition Executive Director, Clay Johnson, graciously invited the White House 2001 Project Director, Professor Martha Kumar, who's with us tonight, to come over and officially deliver the briefing materials we have been providing them throughout the past 6 months, running up to the election and its transition. We have a nice photograph of that event that I brought with us tonight so that you could see the exchange of our information. And in fact, Martha brought with her at some physical cost, given how much these things weigh, a complete copy of the briefing books that we provided to the Bush transition team at their request. Just as an indication of the kind of things that the project has done, not just for the Bush transition team, of course, but for the President Gore-to-be transition team, which never actually got off the ground. In building what has turned out to be this valuable asset for the White House, we have relied heavily on the participation and direct action and expertise of professional scholars like the ones that are here tonight. The program for the evening is as follows. Each of our panelists will give a brief presentation between 15 and 20 minutes on a particular aspect of presidential transitions related to their expertise. After these 3 presentations, we will answer your questions. And feel free to ask about anything, including missing W's on keyboards. It also should be noted that thanks to the efforts of the technical people here at the Baker Institute, and on a moment's notice, I might add, and the technical people at the WhiteHouse2001.org organization in North Carolina, tonight's event is being channeled around the world through the internet. And those in the worldwide audience who are watching this, who wish to ask questions of the panel can do so by emailing chiefsforum@rice.edu, and we will try to have the panelists respond to those questions before the night is over as well. Now to the panelists and their presentations. I'm really excited about this. William Seal is the undisputed reigning expert on the White House, its environs, history, and architecture. His 2-volume book, The President's House, is considered the standard reference work on that building and its political, social, and economic importance. Dr. Seal is also an expert on architectural restoration. I think actually you're working on a house restoration in Houston, is that right? Or, well, he's working on several restorations in a lot of places. And he is, you may have recently seen his TV show on the White House history on the History Channel, and actually he has an upcoming event on PBS as well. Actually, he is a native of Beaumont, Texas, and spends his year living part-time in Arlington, Virginia, and part-time in Jasper, Texas. Tonight, he will review what he sees as some of the most important elements of the lessons presidents pass on from one to the other in the process of presidential transitions. Dr. Seal.
Thanks, Terry. As Terry told you, my interest is social history at the White House. And before I begin with what I've prepared, I want to tell you that it's the best documented house on earth. The National Archives are groaning with hundreds of thousands of papers, little messages from Jefferson's time. And before the days of telephone, that cuts it down a lot. Then computer begins to cut it down. But just endless quantities of material on the house and the running of the house and what people did. And when you relate it to the bigger events, sometimes the results are very interesting. 2 centuries of the changing of the guard at the White House. About half a century ago, when the painters were putting their last coats of fine finish on the Shamrock Hotel here in Houston, President of the United States Harry S. Truman stepped aside to admit a demolition team to enter through the doors of the historic White House to literally pull it all out, clean it out. Truman would replace the old interior structure of wood and brick with a new one of steel, strong like the shamrock and built for the ages. While this character of permanent construction would ultimately lead to the demise of the shamrock, it has helped perpetuate the White House. Had Truman not done what he did, the president would for sure live elsewhere today. It can hardly be imagined. Yet hard on the heels of Truman, President Eisenhower endorsed the idea of a high-rise building on the ellipse south of the White House that would contain presidential quarters on the upper floors. He had visited General Lucius Clay and others at the Waldorf, but the idea didn't last very long. President Eisenhower soon declared through the press that I, quote, never want to live anywhere other than the historic White House. The words had been final words on the subject for at least 6 presidents before him. Even President Truman's renewed house is seeming old again today, if still very durable. It is a huge complex of some 164 rooms snuggled into a late Georgian building that once had only 64. The superstructure is of steel and concrete built within the old stone walls. A grim bomb shelter, now used for storing tables and chairs, brings khaki memories of World War II and, thank God, never saw practical use. Heavy concrete subcellar walls recall the Cold War that inspired their super thickness of 7 feet. Indeed, the whole idea of rebuilding so significant an old building within its original stone outside walls sounds odd to us in our era of purist historic preservation. President Truman's work exactly paralleled the years of the Marshall Plan. General Marshall and his chief lieutenant Will Clayton devised a plan which spread the spirit of rebuilding everywhere in the United States, as well as in war-torn Europe. When the old White House emerged new in 1952, it was, in the modern architectural jargon of the time, a machine for the presidency. Just enough of the relic was left to keep it holy. Everything a president could possibly need was in Harry Truman's White House. Air conditioning, closets, storerooms, many guest rooms, abundant bathrooms, security systems that anticipated the space age. Even the air was analyzed in every room every 30 minutes. It was a whole new house that existed beyond the familiar formal state rooms. Mrs. Roosevelt made a return visit and said the house reminded her now of a Sheraton hotel. Truman had built a broadcast room with a radio in mind. Even before he occupied that room, now non-existent, he saw it filled with television cameras. What a fine and useful backdrop the White House became for the new and exciting medium of communication. And the president's offices grew very rapidly. Denied by Congress funding to expand the West Wing, Truman turned over to President Eisenhower office space that only barely served the purpose. Within a mere 10 years, Truman's rebuilding of the White House construction was underway for extensions of the West Wing function into adjacent new structures, and State War and Navy building, occupied increasingly by the executive since the early 1900s, went over entirely to that branch of government, as well as new buildings off of Lafayette Park. Meanwhile, perhaps more familiar to us all, a youthful First Lady, Jacqueline Kennedy, became engrossed in putting back through antique furnishings the past President Truman seemed to have torn away in his reconstruction of 1948 to 52. The nation was captivated with the White House itself to an extent that had never been the case before. If all this implies change and transition, well, it should. Change and transition are what the White House is all about, and never more dramatically than when a new president takes his oath at the moment. On the head of a pen, the executive department turns from one leadership to another. Maybe an hour or two passes and the White House is quiet. No presidents anywhere, but the machine is still fast at work. If it was Congress that created the White House in the Resident Act of 1790, then it was George Washington who built it. He assumed full control and built it as he thought it should be. He was far more visionary than he's ever given credit for being. The Constitution had created a great state headed by a president with a powerful, almost king-like character, with a kingly mystique that the office still reflects. Washington wanted the Capitol built on the Potomac because he believed the river, properly improved, would become the golden highway inland to the Ohio country and beyond, connecting the vast frontier to the sea. His Washington, D.C. was to be a city of the world like Paris. He knew that to achieve it required his personal endorsement and patronage, and he planned his buildings accordingly, against strong but respectful opposition. George Washington's big ideas were cut down here and there by practicality. The vast presidential palace he commenced became a house a quarter of the original size. This is what we know as the White House. It was his wish that it be of stone like the first buildings of Europe. He had the stone walls richly carved and adorned. Washington probably walked through the nearly finished house as it stood in his last year on earth, 1799, huge and hulking, in size beyond any building in the country, and a heavy coat of whitewash made it seem even bigger. No one but George Washington would ever have built such an ambitious house. Already 6 years after its builder's death, the building was being commonly called the White House. The first occupant was the second president, John Adams. Now, his transition to office had already taken place in 1797 in Philadelphia before the government moved down to the new city. It was a relatively easy transition. Mrs. Adams privately shrank in horror, facing the impending cost of the presidency. General Washington was a rich man, she said. We are not rich. 35 servants shrank to 2, an old couple from Quincy. Some farm girls were brought in as guests to help out. Adams seriously considered occupying a row house in Washington, but yielded at last to living in George Washington's palace. A ragtag palace it became, not finished enough to call home, plaster wet, all of those problems. Worst of all, just as Mr. Adams got warm enough to be comfortable, the neck-and-neck votes began coming in from the national election. Alas, December the 12th, South Carolina's votes defeated him and threw the decision to the Congress between both of his bitter Republican rivals, Jefferson and Aaron Burr. The first transition that actually took place in the White House was not happy. Adams met his old friend, President-elect Jefferson, on the street and cried, "Well, you've put me out." Jefferson responded, "No, it was a constitution in which the very narrow victor Jefferson had played no part in creating. That is what had put him out, by lawful election." Adams tried cooperation. He made suggestions about policy. He offered the state coach and market cart to Jefferson at a low price. All was rejected. Jefferson had ideas of his own. Adams, convinced now that a French-style revolution would soon erupt along the Potomac, determined to put good, sound Federalists in office, and thus in his last days made the notorious midnight appointments in his office upstairs. Jefferson was to call this, in magnificent understatement, unkind. Adams did not stay around for Jefferson's inaugural. Had he followed precedent, he would have remained, for Washington had attended his inaugural and dinner afterward. Instead, Adams departed before dawn on March the 4th, Inauguration Day, having announced his intentions for 4 days in the press. I believe he was afraid of riots in the street, and left so as not to provide a symbol for the departing Federalist government. The inauguration took place without him. The day was calm, wrote prolific Margaret Bayard Smith, who was there. The changes of administration, which in every government and in every age have most generally been epochs of confusion, villainy, and bloodshed, in this our happy country take place without any species of distraction or disorder. Her words ring down through time. The new president remained at his tavern. On the afternoon of his inauguration, he went to the vacant president's house and began planning changes, but he didn't move in for 2 weeks. The changes were important to him, for nothing could have seemed more archaic than Washington's palace. He made every effort to cut it down to size, reducing the grounds from 85 acres to 12, making his office the dominant feature of the unfinished state floor. The cave-like entrance hall he made into a museum of curiosities and opened the house to the public for the first time, and has remained open since. What was available to Jefferson in transition is about what was available to every president to follow for half a century: an abandoned house with government's furniture, usually worn and frayed, and an office with empty shelves. Presidential life was, of course, much simpler then, and in some respects, in spite of many efforts otherwise, it still bears those marks of early years. Jefferson had quirky business habits. He's the only president to have worked without a secretary. The office was in today's state dining room, filled with books, caged birds, prints, maps, and various hobbies of the president. Jefferson had a long, very plain table built, still survives, sort of like a kitchen table, with drawers all around, each drawer with an official subject heading. Here he stashed letters and papers he had to attend to himself, and he was a bit truant at it. Everything else was dispatched next door to the various departments, all housed in 2 brick buildings in the immediate White House grounds, a total of 130 employees. The more ardent Federalists were weeded eventually from public payroll, but there was no drastic turnover. We all know that the midnight appointments did hold in court. Ours in those days was such a country that Jefferson could rule it virtually alone. Parenthetically, his one secretary was Meriwether Lewis, who I've never found a paper that was signed by Meriwether Lewis in any kind of secretarial function. He lived in the house and took lessons from Jefferson, lived in a sort of a tent arrangement in the south end of the unfinished East Room. Jefferson, in theory at least, reduced the presidency from the head of the state envisioned by Washington to a chief executorship, which would hold until the close of the 19th century. The office had already been heading that way under Adams, reluctantly. The transition from Jefferson to Madison was friend to friend. Jefferson remained more than a month as a guest while the house was in turmoil, having its parlors and dining room redecorated by the architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe, who even installed the first central heating furnace. Madison was served by several secretaries and returned to the office to where Adams had had it upstairs, where it was to remain for nearly a century. The secretaries all lived in. It was in James Madison's second term that the British invaded American soil and burned the public buildings, leaving the White House a shell of stone. The Madisons fled, never to live in the White House again, and the transition to James Monroe took place in a row house several blocks away, while the White House was being rebuilt, thus a transition within a transition. It was a gentle exchange. Within a year, Monroe moved into the rebuilt White House, which he turned over after 8 years to John Quincy Adams after the contested election of 1824 settled in the House of Representatives. 4 years later, in 1828, when Andrew Jackson was inaugurated, the nation, when he was inaugurated March the 4th, 29, the nation saw the bitterest transition in its history. The election of 1824 was considered by the defeated a stolen contest. Democracy and aristocracy versus common man became the simple theme, and the campaign ran 4 full years all through Adams' administration. It was a dirty campaign. Andrew Jackson's wife Rachel became the object of opponent mockery. Shadows cast on hers and Jackson's marriage in the newspapers may have led to her death in 1829, just after his election. At least Jackson believed that. She had cried on her deathbed, "I'd rather be a doorkeeper in the house of God than a queen in that palace," the palace being the White House. The victorious but mourning Jackson loathed John Quincy Adams. There was no interaction between the two before Jackson's inauguration or after. Like the 5 presidents before him and all of those since, Adams made a careful inventory of the government property in the White House, furnishing, silver, and the like. He departed the morning of March the 4th to a house elsewhere in town. Some of his servants were hired on at the White House, but they were subjected to such ill treatment by Jackson that they soon left. That they remained there at all, however, marked the beginning of White House employees continuing from one administration to the other. That was the first time. It might be said, too, that they came in very handy for the past experience they shared. When the White House was assaulted by several thousand merrymakers who followed the new President Jackson from the Capitol and flowed into the house behind him, Jackson was mashed against a parlor wall and had to be extracted by aides and carried down the south stairs to a waiting carriage to his hotel. The crowd still wouldn't leave. The experienced staff filled wash tubs with orange juice and whiskey and placed those on the south grounds, effectively emptying the house. Then they locked the doors. They were so good that no bills for repairs appear in the federal records. Paradoxically, as a few employees began to remain at the service level in the White House, the federal bureaucracy was thinned by the new Democrats as never before, and Jackson men were hired. To the victor go the spoils was the banner of the Jacksonian democracy, and while it was not as extreme as it might seem, it established a pattern for the balance of the 19th century. Washington was to see enormous turnovers from political parties changed at the White House. The office at the White House itself saw complete turnovers for years. Normally, the president's office staff was made up of family members in the early days, a son or a nephew. There was no government-paid presidential secretary until 1846 under Polk. Even so, the secretary was Polk's nephew. In Jackson's case, his wife's nephew, Andrew Jackson Donaldson, became secretary to the president and also head of the party. Donaldson, his wife, and 4 children and 4 slaves lived in the White House in the family rooms with Jackson, Emily Donaldson serving as the president's hostess. Jackson had various hangers-on, notably Major William B. Lewis and the painter Ralph E.W. Earl, who kept a studio in today's Queen's bedroom selling portraits of Andrew Jackson and other luminaries of the new democracy by the score. I'll linger a bit on Andrew Jackson, for it was during his time that the White House was completed. He built the north portico to complement James Monroe's south portico, and he completed the east room, as well as to outgarden about anybody else who ever gardened in White House history. He was in a vague beginning sense a media sort of a president. Although only in his 60s, he seemed much older. He was not well. His election as hero and champion of the common man called for a certain level of illustration, and while television was a long way off, railroads first linked Washington with the nation during the presidency, so there was an increasing audience. The presence of Jackson in the White House drew crowds as had never been seen there before. Beyond the mahogany doors, up the grand stairs, was an old man in perpetual rheumatic pain, thin and pale. His managers, if we can dare call them that out of his hearing, had Mr. Earl paint a heroic picture of him to hang in the hall for the visiting public to see. It rivaled the famous painting of Washington by Stuart, which hung in the house. When the East Room was furnished, a galaxy of papier-mâché stars was pasted over the archway through which Jackson entered his receptions. At the right moment, the Marine Band struck up a fanfare, and Jackson appeared, enveloped in a long dark blue cape with a high collar, his white hair swept back. The effect was impressive and found its way into the popular iconography in prints and newspaper cuts. Jackson the hero. This image is perpetuated in bronze across Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House on his rearing horse. Transition was no different in the wake of Jackson. The office emptied. Some staff remained in the house, servants. In 1853, the party-loving Franklin Pierce, his wife back in New England, stumbled into a dark White House long after the gas went out, with no one to greet him, and he and his bodyguard, the first presidential bodyguard in history, scrambled around for a bit of a candle to light their way upstairs to bed. Yet need for some years, dialogue between outgoing and incoming had been seen as necessary. It simply seemed an impossible objective, considering personal feelings and the fact that a president stays president until the very last minute. Outgoing presidents invariably insisted upon complete deference to their status. On the other hand, nearly always, advice from the outgoing president was not welcomed, if not requested, by the incoming president. If this was the case in relatively calm times, imagine the difficulty in times of national tension. In fact, the situation was usually eased behind the scenes by the outgoing of Secretary of State, who became the informal, unofficial liaison. Therefore, when Lincoln and his entourage arrived in Washington, with a standoff at Fort Sumter hot in the news and the entire nation locked in anticipation, the president-elect sent his secretary, the Belgian-born John Nicolay, to call on James Buchanan's Secretary of State, Jeremiah Black. They had a long informal visit, for which the notes all survive in the National Archives. Abraham Lincoln didn't mind being presented to the public as a rail splitter, but as president he intended to do things like a gentleman. Every detail of everything social was carefully written down by Nicolay, down to where the president and his wife were to sit at dinner. Protocol, then a word unknown, was clarified, and the names noted of especially helpful individuals around town. At the time of Lincoln's death, with the close of war, the White House erupted into a sort of chaos that ran on for several months, until the Vice President, Andrew Johnson, effected a complete reorganization and an update of the offices. He installed telegraph in the office and enlarged the presidential staff to 12. His was the last complete turnover of office staff. Beginning with U.S. Grant in 1869, a skeletal office staff began to take root that rose quickly to 16, then 30 by the end of the century. About half the employees would remain from administration to administration thereafter. You never knew who paid them. They were paid out of any office in any department in the government. Colonel Bill Crook would serve from Lincoln's on to Theodore Roosevelt's administration, and one Octavius Pruden would die in office under Franklin D. Roosevelt. Crook left a memoir, but he was about the only one. They were mostly men who had long since divested themselves of any wish to communicate with the public. They felt privileged. I suppose it was the long Republican years that made it possible to develop permanent staff, although it did not come about by any master plan. Like nearly all institutions within the White House, it simply grew out of habit. Having permanent staff naturally changed the White House. These individuals were not truly permanent any more than the several thousand permanent executive staff are, in fact, immovable today. All were and they are subject to the President's pleasure. The first job of the White House, whatever else it may be, is to serve the President in his work. Yet they served a certain basic administrative function that gave that aspect of the President's work stability that it had not known before. As the office staff gained ongoing members, so did the House. Coachmen, butlers, maids, and all the others that kept the White House going were often continued, or at least came from a preferred pool of people in Washington considered right for the work. Right meant that they kept their mouths shut outside of the iron fence. They did not labor without direction, but often by habit. Already since the 1840s, management of the House had been presided over by members of the Metropolitan Police Force. They first came as guards, replacing on an everyday basis hidden sharpshooters that had patrolled the roof at large functions since the War of 1812. Because of a general distaste for military display at the White House, that was pretty much a given from the start, the police officers wore business suits. They also carried firearms. They were first called doorkeepers. They became so useful at directing activities in the White House that by the 1850s they were indispensable. President Buchanan, fresh from diplomatic duty at St. James, renamed the doorkeepers ushers in the British manner, which they are called today. when they are no longer connected with the police force but form an administrative staff attached by congressional appropriation to the White House. Behold then a knowledgeable base of people extant at the White House during the turnover from one president to the other. Transition, though it was never called that, became easier. The new president and his aides had people there to teach them. On the social front, good advice was at the State Department, where any innovation had to pass muster first. The third Secretary of State by the 1890s was an intense man named Alvey Addy. He worked in that office from the late 80s through the 1920s, and in spite of profound deafness and difficulty with his speech, maintained full control of protocol at the White House for half a century. When he died in 1923, he was replaced by an entire department, the Department of Protocol. That office dominated White House ceremonial and official duties until relatively recent years, when the task is shared by the East Wing Social Office. Yet in spite of various helpers, the transition remained a rather casual thing, dominated by the clock on inaugural day. With Andrew Jackson, the new president's journey down Pennsylvania Avenue turned into a regular parade. Jefferson and Monroe had marched with a militia and some ceremony. Jackson, mounted on a gray horse, had been held in place with a long cape as he held his high bell-shaped hat aloft to the multitudes. It took him more than an hour and a half to get from the Capitol to the White House gates, so vast were the crowds. After him, other attractions appeared to enhance the trip for lesser heroes. For William Henry Harrison, a full-scale log cabin on wheels. For others, floats with white-gowned maidens singing of Columbia and her virtues. During the Civil War, reviewing stands were built in front of the White House for military parades, culminating in the June 1865 Grand Review of the Armies of the Union. No parade was ever more popular than that or more triumphant. It lasted 2 days. Grant's inauguration then saw the first such stand built in 1869, and the custom continues today. The inaugural parade, ever grander as the decades of the 19th century passed, provided an entire afternoon for transition at the White House, as it still does. Wagons pulled up to the south portico, unloading and loading. Presidents didn't bring much furniture with them in those days, unless you focus on Rutherford B. Hayes, an avid collector of antiques. Generally, what they moved were their clothes, presidential gifts, books, and the like. Normally, if a president knew he was leaving, the process began with a trickle in the summer before, when the House was closed down for the hot months. The pattern of transition was much like it is today, only not so fine-tuned or extensive. For a week in advance, the reviewing stand is in preparation. On the morning of the inauguration, March the 4th, which was before 1933, when it became January the 20th, the president-elect and his wife call on the president. They have coffee in the Red Room. They join in a carriage, now car, and head for the Capitol. Almost immediately after lunch at the White House, today at the Capitol to free the White House further, they mount the reviewing stand while the House behind them is being readied. Through the years, the process of readying the House has become very efficient, the work of some 100 men and women. Exploring and characterizing the moments of contrast between the president and the president-elect on Inauguration Day would make a book in itself. I think of a faltering Andrew Jackson lifted into a coach made from the timbers of the USS Constitution in 1837 being driven to the railroad station. Of Lincoln and Buchanan and Lincoln's gracious thanks that the harried Buchanan had kept the Union together, if perilously, for him to address as he saw fit. There is William McKinley going to his second inaugural alone, both president and president-elect, having forced the presidency from a century of chief executive into the head of a great world power in 1898, a man also soon to die. Theodore Roosevelt, who dramatized the new presidency for the world, riding suspiciously alongside William Howard Taft, who had only quietly listened to Roosevelt's ranting that his policies be continued intact. A jolly Taft 4 years later, eager to turn the presidency over to Woodrow Wilson. Taft stayed so long at the luncheon they thought they'd have to ask him to leave. A faded, ill Woodrow Wilson 8 years later, riding beside the handsome, rakish Elks Clubber of a Warren G. Harding, who just couldn't get enough of the crowd's adoration. Herbert Hoover, determined to school the incoming president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, whom he thought knew nothing about running the country, sinking at last silently back into the automobile's cushions in exasperation, looking dead ahead, while his bubbling successor waved his hat and smiled. That was a bitterness that never subsided from either side. We remember the rest from the news. Truman and Eisenhower, the president-elect declining to wear a top hat and insisting upon a Hamburg. Eisenhower and Kennedy, the president certain that all he had worked to build would go down the drain. Johnson, who rode alone as president and president-elect. Nixon twice. Ford, whose only inaugural parade was with his successor, Jimmy Carter. Reagan, one parade, the second snowed out. Bush from George to George, Clinton too, and now a Bush again. As these were going on, the White House was being disassembled from years of occupation by one family and prepared for another one. The clock still rules on inaugural day. The outgoing president may be outgoing, but he's still president. Only once has this really been bent, when Rutherford B. Hayes' inauguration would have fallen on a Sunday, and inaugurations not being held on Sunday, he was sworn in quietly in the Red Room before dinner on Saturday evening, outgoing President Grant and the Chief Justice in attendance, the results announced at the following dinner. Again, with a contested election, there had been fear that there would be riots on a day without a president. The White House is never a more machine for the presidency than in transition. Plans are made more than a year in advance. Trucks at the storage facilities in Maryland are fitted for the work, many packing boxes made. The transfer begins the day before, long before the president has departed to the Capitol with the president-elect. The incumbent family uses only certain rooms while others are being changed. When they depart, the movers, White House staff, complete the change. It seems effortless, but the players are trained to one house, one circumstance. There's no real controversy. Painters at work, plumbers at work. It's unbelievable. The larger picture of transition is never easy. While recent West Wing pranks cum vandalism are unique to my knowledge in the history of the White House, nevertheless, a cold and abandoned place still faces new staffers, no matter how cordial the transfer may be. FDR sighed to see his empty desk drawers on March the 4th, 1933. His luggage was not unpacked. January, actually, 1933. His luggage was not unpacked. That is not likely the case anymore, with a physical transition at least. It is still a mighty jump from one presidency to the next. All of the players in transition arrived jubilantly. Long ago, Jefferson planted weeping willows beside a now long-abandoned White House rear gate. The saying grew as the willows grew. The presidents enter on the north smiling with joy and depart after their time weeping with the willows. It is not always a happy event to leave the presidency. Sometimes the saddest are family members. Perhaps the most dramatic of these sorrowful players was Mrs. Ulysses S. Grant. How Julia Grant loved the White House, calling it a heavenly paradise of orchids. Grant's refusal to run for a third term had devastated her. She never forgave him. While the White House was her world. On the day of her departure, she saw to making every arrangement perfect for her successors, but she was not a good sport at all. She complained to her husband, careful that no one else overheard. As the carriage waited, she lingered in the Blue Room. Grant called to her that it was time to go. How pretty the house was, she recalled. Flowers on the tables, sunlight falling through the lace curtains, how sweet it looked. She held up through the inauguration until she boarded the train for New York. Then in the privacy of the railroad car, she tells herself, in an ambition and an abandon of grief, I threw myself on the lounge and wept so bitterly. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. John Burke has worked directly on the White House 2001 project, preparing two important and widely read reports on previous modern transitions. His new book, Presidential Transitions from Politics to Practice, was read by the transition teams for both parties, and his reports for the White House 2001 project circulated as required reading among the Bush transition team. John is professor of political science at the University of Vermont. Tonight, he will talk about the central lessons learned from previous presidential transitions and how the Bush team has done so far in the previous week. John.
Well, thank you, Terry. It's indeed a pleasure to be here this evening. Let me first state, tongue-in-cheek, I want to emphasize that tongue-in-cheek, that for those of us who study these matters, the transition to the presidency of George W. Bush is something of a disappointment. And I say that because, at least on the surface, it puts to the lie a bit of conventional wisdom that many of us share who study transitions, namely that the period from the first Tuesday in November until Inauguration Day on January 20th provides barely enough time, even under the best of circumstances, for a president-elect to take those steps that are necessary to assume office effectively. Now, this year, of course, was not a time of ordinary circumstances. The formal transition was truncated by roughly half beginning on December 13th following Al Gore's concession speech. Yet the Bush transition soon unfolded, and with requisite speed, precision, and competence. Even the New York Times, in a page-one article last Sunday, conceded that the Bush transition was a success. Now consider the following facts. By January 2nd of this year, George W. Bush had finished up with his cabinet selection. This placed him only about a week behind Clinton's schedule in 1992. More notable, in fact, President-elect Bush was actually well ahead of Clinton in naming his White House staff. In 1992, Bill Clinton's press secretary, his White House legal counsel, his congressional liaison person, and his domestic policy advisor were not announced until the last week before his inauguration. All of these positions in the Bush White House were unveiled earlier, and in some cases much earlier. Andrew Card was de facto chief of staff the day after the election, with an official appointment on November 27th, immediately following the certification of the Florida popular vote. In 1992, by contrast, Bill Clinton's chief of staff, Mac McClarty, was appointed on December 12th. Al Gonzalez, the Bush White House counsel, and Karen Hughes, his communications director, were tapped on December 17th, as was Clay Johnson, the personnel director for the White House, shortly thereafter, weeks before their Clinton counterparts. In each of these cases, critical appointments were swiftly made, and all were crucial in enabling this administration to hit the ground running. In so doing, I think this transition followed one of the key lessons of prior transitions. Early staff appointments enable the person not only to get a leg up on their job, but it also enables the transition to move on to other levels of staff positions. In Bill Clinton's case, he and his advisors were essentially still stuck at the top level of the White House staff the week before inauguration, while the so-called truncated Bush transition had moved on to second, third, and in some cases fourth levels of the White House staff. The Bush transition also filled some key positions early, another important lesson. The chief of staff is important for obvious reasons. An early appointment there is critical to filling the rest of the White House staff. But two of the other positions that then Governor Bush filled early, the Office of White House Legal Counsel and the head of the White House Personnel Office, the positions that Al Gonzalez and Clay Johnson now hold, are also very key because they are so integrally involved in the appointment and vetting process for all presidential appointees. To draw a contrast with 1992, think of all the difficulties that Bill Clinton's legal counsel, Bernie Nussbaum, appointed in just the last week before inauguration, encountered in the early days and months of that administration. I think the truth of the recent Bush transition is that while Florida may have delayed the public presentation of the new administration and the handing over of the keys to transition headquarters in Washington, the transition was in fact well underway, and appropriately so, hanging chads, swinging chads, dimpled chad, pimpled chads, all kinds of chads notwithstanding. Bill Daley, Al Gore's campaign chief, was dead wrong, I think, a day or two after the election, to suggest that Governor Bush was being too presumptuous to start his transition and that he ought to wait until the Florida outcome was fully settled. The transition needed to occur, and fortunately it did occur, albeit with more discretion than is the norm. In fact, I think the Florida delay may have had a positive side to it in that it enabled Bush and his advisors to do transition planning, but without the media spotlight and other pressures that normally occur. Now, the key to understanding the Bush transition, and to some extent I think its success, lies in the fact that it was well underway even before Election Day in November. Early last year, then Governor Bush entrusted his Chief of Staff, Clay Johnson, with the task of thinking about and beginning to plan for a possible presidency. Quote, "I would like you to figure out what we need to do starting the day after the election," Bush told him. "Come up with a plan. Talk to people who have done this before. Read what you can get your hands on, confer with people, pick their brains, and come up with a plan." Now, that effort may seem a bit like measuring the White House drapes a bit too prematurely, but in my view, it is necessary. In fact, recent presidential candidates have all done likewise. Carter, Reagan, Bush Sr., and Bill Clinton also began to plan for their respective presidencies well before Election Day. So did their electoral opponents. This year, by the way, Al Gore did the same, Richard Daley's comments about the Bush team being presumptuous notwithstanding. Now, I think there are several facets of Clay Johnson's efforts before the November election that are especially notable and I think contribute to the success of this transition. Number one, he proceeded with discretion. There was no media attention about it that I know of until shortly before Election Day. That is different, by the way, from 1992, when a number of stories appeared about the Clinton pre-election effort, much to the consternation of his campaign war room. And that led, in turn, to some counterproductive internal battles that spilled out after Election Day and delayed his transition. Number two, Clay Johnson knew his principal, George W. Bush, as a chief executive with a particular leadership and decision-making style, and he knew the Bush agenda. Number three, he did his homework. He learned the lessons of prior transitions, especially so that past mistakes would not be repeated. In an interview he gave to the Washington Post in late December, he laid out those lessons, all of which I think are valuable. Here they are. Proceed with hiring based on the new administration's policy priorities. Pick your chief of staff early. Have a clear understanding of what qualities you are looking for in personnel to counterbalance the political pressure to make certain appointments. And finally, develop a clear set of policy goals. Otherwise, in his words, you will have your goals set for you. Now, Clay Johnson is, of course, only part of the story of this transition. This was also a transition that benefited from the cabinet and White House experience of two very talented persons, Dick Cheney and Andrew Card. No recent transition, in my view, has had the benefit of drawing upon their particular skills and firsthand knowledge. In fact, there are some press accounts that suggest that Cheney's previous experience in transitions was in George Bush's mind when he selected him as his running mate back in July. And then there's George W. Bush. The transition has shown us that he does delegate, but he is not afraid to surround himself with considerable talent. He has been careful in his choices. Commitment to the Bush agenda has been a recurring theme. Teamwork has been an operative principle. I think, for example, his cautiousness and concerns about some of the names presented to him for Secretary of Defense is especially revealing. A politically easy choice was available, but he demurred and selected Don Rumsfeld instead. He achieved a diverse cabinet without engaging in the politics of diversity talk. With his White House staff, he has melded those with prior Washington experience together with those who served him in Austin. Throughout the transition, he structured a number of his activities to advance his political agenda, meetings with educators, business leaders, those involved in faith-based initiatives. During his first week in office, according to one report, he had met with over 90 members of Congress in small groups. Clinton, by contrast, had met with only 14, and Bush Sr. 7. Over the last week and a half since his inauguration, he has stayed on message, and I think he has been fairly successful in rolling out his policy agenda, the Ashcroft nomination notwithstanding. I should note here, I think Karl Rove's efforts have been especially important in this regard. During the transition, Rove too did his homework and studied the day-to-day activities of Bush's predecessors. And together with Karen Hughes, they have crafted a political and media strategy for the first 180 days of the new administration. Now, I would be remiss, however, if I failed to take note of some of the challenges that may be lurking in this transition to power. A recent article in the New York Times Magazine was titled CEO USA. And the author of the piece states that George W. Bush is, quote, the first president with a business degree who actually does have a plan. Sell, delegate, and get out of the way. Now, I have no difficulty with most of that, but the last phrase, get out of the way, may prove to be especially troubling if it is true. I hope it's not, and simply a bit of journalistic hype. I don't happen to think that President Bush, is in fact a hands-off manager. This is, after all, the person to whom his father delegated the delicate task of informing John Sununu that his services were no longer needed as Chief of Staff. Also, it is my sense that Bush welcomes policy debate and the give and take of discussion and deliberation among his assistants. This is not a Richard Nixon who wants to be left alone with his yellow legal pad to figure it out all by himself. Yet the challenges of the presidency will present, yet the demands of the presidency will present a new set of challenges. While President Bush need not become a Jimmy Carter, drowning himself in the details of policy options and correcting spelling mistakes on memorandum, George W. Bush and his associates have crafted a presidency that will require him to be a central and active force in its effective operation and management. President Bush has assembled a talented cabinet, arguably one of the strongest among his recent presidents. But with talent, there will likely come disagreement. When Colin Powell and Donald Rumsfeld are on opposite ends of a policy argument, and at some point they will be, it will be left to one person and one person alone to make a decision and chart the course. There is, I think, an interesting difference in this cabinet from that of his father's. George Bush Sr. had a strong personal connection to just about everyone in his cabinet. Some were close personal friends, others were political supporters, or associates from the Reagan presidency. I think that is less so in the present cabinet. Some of the political figures closer to George W. Bush personally were passed over for a variety of reasons, whether it was a Frank Keating or a Tom Ridge. And I think that may make his task more difficult. Yes, in picking the cabinet, he has emphasized allegiance to his agenda, the importance of trust, his feel for the person, all have been important in his selection process. But that common bond, that sense of teamwork, which is necessary to make a cabinet work, may not yet be there. With his White House staff, President Bush has created a new division of labor with Andrew Card in the role of Chief of Staff, but with Karl Rove and Karen Hughes in equally prominent roles. This arrangement replicates to a degree his Texas Iron Triangle, but it will require an unusual degree of trust, cooperation, and agreement to function effectively. Most importantly, but not exclusively, the principal to whom they will report, the president, will need himself to continually foster that trust and cooperation lest competing power centers develop and intramural squabbling ensue. More generally, during his governorship, campaign, and through the transition, there has been a real sense, I think, of discipline in the Bush team. Few reports of internal squabbling, less leaking to the media, and I think it'll be interesting to see if this continues. Undoubtedly, a larger group of people are now involved by many-fold, and Washington is a sieve. And it will be interesting, I think, to see how well that discipline survives. Effective presidencies are not just about enlisting the services of bright, able, experienced people. They are also about the processes in which those people interact and how those processes have bearing on the decisions presidents must make. For example, there has been occasional talk in the media of some type of cabinet government in the Bush presidency. But cabinet government, in the sense of some collective decision-making process by the entire group, simply does not work. However, just as past transitions offer useful lessons, so too do past presidencies, especially with the variety of ways that subunits of the cabinet, often called cabinet councils, have been organized and operated for better or worse. Furthermore, President Bush has assembled a talented White House staff, and talented staffs can become powerful staffs, dominating the policymaking process. How are the efforts of both a talented staff and a talented cabinet effectively integrated? Processes also test policy. They can provide a check on the work of others. This may be especially important for a president prone to delegate. Are the conclusions drawn in that memo by Cabinet Member X or White House Staff Member Y well-founded? Have alternatives been explored, proper data utilized, implications examined, correct conclusions drawn? Members of the Bush team are not ignorant of these problems. In the words of one Bush staff member, quote, "Delegate but verify," end quote, will be the order of the day. However, I think it still remains open how such verification will occur. The Bush policy agenda. For those of us who have studied transitions and early presidencies, one pattern stands out, and that is that successful presidents must pare down quickly from a myriad of policy ideas that have often been floated during the campaign to a much more limited agenda once they are in office. Moreover, they must prioritize that agenda. This Bush has done. In fact, I think it's something that contributed greatly to his success as governor. A limited agenda and a focused message. The difficulty that will lie ahead over the coming months is how to translate even that limited agenda into successful legislation. The challenge here, how much will President Bush be willing to compromise? He resisted, in the aftermath of the election, the temptation to abandon his agenda and govern from the center. I happen to think he was right to do that. This cannot be, nor should it be, some kind of coalition presidency. But he will have to compromise. He will need to determine where to draw the line. You in Texas have more firsthand knowledge of how he did that as governor. But in Washington, the center of political gravity is different, and the task will be more difficult. Here, by the way, is where I think Dick Cheney's role will be most significant. Not just in policy, not in the internal debates within the White House, as was Al Gore's role, but in dealing with Congress and providing advice about legislative strategy. Thus, it is Cheney's third hat that may be the most important, not as former Chief of Staff, not as former Defense Secretary, but as a former leader of the House of Representatives. Let me conclude. One of the most important challenges facing President Bush still looms ahead. How he handles the first unanticipated crisis or policy problem. Perhaps there was a dry run a bit with the Linda Chavez nomination. But there will be some scandal, perhaps some crises, whether foreign or domestic, something in the weeks ahead that no one has yet anticipated or even planned for. Staff members, members of the cabinet, Dick Cheney even, won't have time necessarily to prepare for it. But it will be President George W. Bush that will have to deal with it. How he does so will be telling. And it will serve, I think, as the real test for the success of his transition to the presidency. Thank you.
Thanks, John. For those of you who haven't met her, Dr. Martha Kumar is the founder in the White House 2001 Project. She is professor of political science at Towson University and fellow of the James McGregor Burns Academy of Leadership. Her book, Portraying the Presidency, is the standard reference on presidential press relations, and her new book, Wired for Pictures and Sound, long delayed by her work on the White House 2001 Project, has been widely anticipated as the chronicle of effective presidential communications. Essentially what we've done tonight is start with the past, work forward to the present, and now Martha is going to talk about the future. In preparing for that, Martha has been asked to talk about what constitutes a highly effective presidential communications operation and how presidents lead by communicating. Her topic tonight is something for which she's very familiar. She's spent the last 3 years in the White House, working in the lower press office, observing press relations with the president, and has in fact managed to do something that other political scientists have not managed to do, and that is get into the White House and stay in the White House. She's had unprecedented access to the White House in both the Clinton and now the Bush administrations. Martha.
I know you all are going to want to ask some questions, and I thought what I might do is try to shorten mine up a bit and get to some of the essential parts of the communications operation. But first, think about it. What when a president comes in, say when President Bush finished with the inaugural parade, and he turns around to go into the White House and into the West Wing. He goes down the driveway and he passes there an area that's it's a graveled area where there a dozen, on a normal day, there are a dozen cameras that are ready to go, that correspondents can come out and immediately do reports. And that's an area that's known as Pebble Beach for the gravel. And so he's got those cameras there that are all the time waiting to photograph whatever is going on and get news into the bloodstream very, very fast. If he walked into the West Wing and it was say around 9:30 in the morning, there would be a group of reporters that are waiting for the press secretary to go into the press secretary's office. This is the first session that the press secretary has every day, and it's known as the gaggle. The gaggle that Ari Fleischer had last Monday on the first day of business had maybe 50 to 60 people were crammed into his office. You have reporters all around the White House. You have them in the area that used to be a swimming pool that Franklin Roosevelt built and that Richard Nixon covered over. You have a press briefing room that you see. that when you see the press secretary's televised briefing, and sometimes you see the president come out there. There are 48 seats there that the reporters use, and many end up standing along the side. Behind there are booths for the wire services and the networks that maybe accommodate, and then downstairs as well. I've been downstairs in the area there in the lower basement area, and there are places for another 60 or so people. So you've got all of these reporters in the building. Why should a president want to have them there? Because here they're yelling questions at him, tries to get on a helicopter. You'll have Sam Donaldson, used to yell at Reagan and yelled at Clinton as well. Why should a president put up with that? And presidents have really found, the ones who have been very successful, that they have found that maybe reporters are a pain in the neck, but they are definitely worth having around. If you look at the 10 presidents who have served since World War II, there are 4 of them that have been elected to second terms. And when you look at them, you will notice that there's something that they have in common, even though they're very different in their ideologies and different in parties as well. Because you have Eisenhower, Nixon, Reagan, and then Clinton. And they represent a lot of differences, but their similarity is that, and you probably find some others, but the one I look for, because I'm interested in the White House and the press, is that all of those presidents had very effective communications operations. They were interested in using that relationship with news organizations to try to portray their administrations in the way that they were interested in doing. And so they spent a lot of time in their press relations, both in trying to get their message across, but also in fostering a good relationship with reporters. The relationship today is a relationship that has a lot of tension in it. It's not as warm and easy a relationship as it was perhaps in an earlier time. One of the pictures that's in this exhibit is an interesting one to talk about an earlier relationship. It's a picture of the Eisenhowers at the back of a train where they're both in their bathrobes. When that picture was taken, there were a group of reporters and photographers who were traveling with the Eisenhowers. And one morning, one of the photographers noticed that the Eisenhowers would come out early in the morning when they were parked in a rail yard. And so he noticed that they also would talk to the people who were around, because people knew they were coming, and so there were people who would come out early and greet them. And so this enterprising photographer went out and took a picture, and he sent it back to New York. He did not tell any of the other photographers that he had taken the picture. Well, it wasn't too long before the other photographers heard from their news organizations. They got what was termed a rocket from their editors, and their editors wanted to know where was their picture. So they went to Jim Haggerty, the press secretary, and asked him if he could get the Eisenhowers to put their bathrobes back on again, go to the back of the train, and have that picture taken again. And the Eisenhowers were willing to do it. Now, I don't know whether that picture is the first picture or the second picture. I noticed that she had a bracelet on, so I suspect it was the second picture when they were asked to do it again. That's a kind of relationship that I don't think you would see today. But you would see the same interest by presidents and by their staffs in trying to make sure that they have a good relationship with news organizations and that they get covered the way that they wish to do. In looking at those 4 presidents who have had a successful relationship in terms of their communications with news organizations, they all had a sense that if they were going to get their policies through, that it was going to be in a daily basis through news organizations. They couldn't spend that much time. They couldn't get time from the media to go directly to the press, so they would have to go directly to the public. They were going to have to, on a regular basis, go through news organizations. And so they set about establishing organizations within the White House that would be helpful to that end. In the case of Eisenhower, Jim Haggerty, his press secretary, who really does rank as one of the best, was the first press secretary to have a sense of long-range planning. And he would, when Eisenhower went on vacation, he used to gather up all of the appointments they were planning on making, various orders that they may think about doing, and he would take them when they went on vacation to Denver. He would take along all of these things they had been planning on doing. He would just dole them out day after day, you know, a few things each day, so that that it appeared as if the president was indeed active all year round, even if he was at that point out on the golf course. Well, what are the things they have in common in their organizations? And I think that it is interesting that that as different as these presidents are, that you can look at their organizations and see things that were similar. They were centrally organized, and they were disciplined. They had limited access to the president, and they had planning operations where they weren't just working on today, but they were working on tomorrow and trying to take advantage of the schedules that exist. They were integrated in terms of their policy and publicity, as well as their politics. And their organizations were staffed by professionals. These were people who had a good sense of what the news routines were of organizations, how to take advantage of them, and what are the rhythms of Washington, the kinds of things that happen through a year, the things that you can anticipate, and how do you take advantage of them. And then all of them as well applied whatever tools they thought were necessary to get the job done. That may require creating something that is new, as in the Clinton administration. They used ads in the budget fight that they got in with the Republicans, and they used ads in major markets around the country to portray the Republicans as the ones who were shutting down the government, and the Clinton administration is the one that was trying to keep things going. And those ads became the base for the campaign in 1996. Polling has become one of the applied tools that has been used in most recent administrations. Well, when you look at the first point, the centrally organized operations, you can see that in these administrations where they were their communications operations were successful, the chiefs of staff were very involved in communications. For example, in the Reagan administration, James Baker was involved in communications on a regular basis, talking to reporters on a background basis, explaining what their policies were and what hazards they might have and how they planned on dealing with them. His theory, as well as that of Erskine Bowles and Leon Panetta and John Podesta, all of them who were chiefs who were dealing with communications, they all felt that you needed to explain your policies, and you had to be done right from the center. And in this administration, I think you can see, even in these early period, that Andy Card is a person who has been publicly very present. In the weekend Sunday talk shows, you see him. I think starting with chiefs of staff with Leon Panetta, you see them very much presence in explaining a president's programs. Panetta had been as a member of Congress and the chairman of the House Budget Committee, was regularly on television and very used to explaining policy, and so as chief of staff he continued to do that. Bowles did not do much of that, but John Podesta did, and as we've seen in the last couple of weekends, Andy Card has as well. I think now you're going to see the chief take that kind of role. In looking at the integration of policy and politics and publicity, there you have elements that are having a strategy development, operation, planning, and coordination, and then undertaking certain kinds of operations and services for news organizations. And I think you see in the early Bush period that you do see this being done. They integrated the the policies, priorities that they established during the campaign. They had 4 things that they focused on: education, tax cuts, Social Security, Medicare, and the military buildup. And those 4 issues have became important for them in these first weeks. Last week we saw was Education Week, and they developed a variety of events that would showcase the president's position and then also bring together members of Congress who come in to talk with the president about the issue. And then they would have, following that meeting, the members of Congress go out to an area that's called the Stakeout. The Stakeout is an operation that's actually run by the press. It's not run by the White House, but the White House is willing to make people available for it. So there's no transcript for it. That's when members of Congress and others come to the area where there are microphones right outside the West Wing, and right outside the West Wing door. And you had in the education event on last Tuesday, Senator Kennedy and then and House member George Miller came out and talked about the president's education policy. And both of them were talked in very favorable terms about their meeting with the president. And those kinds of sessions and those appearances by members of Congress of both parties were very favorable to the president in his first week. As John was saying, he met with 90 people in that members of Congress in the first week, and of those 90, 29 of them were Democrats. And every day he met with Democrats as well as Republicans, and he brought in other Democrats as well. In his first day, in Monday, he brought in Robert Strauss, Jody Powell, and a group of other Democrats who have been around Washington for some while to let everybody know he's interested in finding out how does the place work. He also talked with 17 governors in that first week, and he talked to 12 foreign leaders. So he made himself very available and set out a very controlled way of laying out his agenda during that first week. And in some ways, he certainly learned that the schedules of others are going to impinge upon yours, but they were able to keep on the message. The first day that they were in the White House was the anniversary of Roe versus Wade. But even though they dealt with the abortion issue, they still were having education events and showcasing them. So in their first week, they have managed to develop a message and stay on that message. And I think part of the way in which they were able to do that is in creating their communications operations. And they have developed one that takes advantage of 5 different sources of information and knowledge that are important to a White House. That is knowledge of the president. They need to have people in the communications operation and elsewhere who has a sense of the president. What are his rhythms, his style of communications? How does he like information given to him? What sorts of events does he like to participate in? Then you need a memory of a campaign. That is important because you need to have people there who know why it is that you were there in the first place. That when you lose that, when those people leave, a White House often forms a vacuum, as happened in the second Reagan administration after Mr. Baker and others left for other positions. There were very few people who remembered that original campaign. So they have people from the campaign. They have people with substantive knowledge in the areas of foreign policy, national security policy, the economics, and then also domestic policy. And they also have brought in people who have a sense of the White House. How does the White House work? Because there's certain rhythms to it and patterns that you can find going back in several administrations. And then they have people that have a sense of the Washington community. That is, who have served in the Congress in one way or another. I mean, if not as a member of Congress, people who have worked there. For example, Ari Fleischer, who is the press secretary, has that kind of knowledge. He worked for the Ways and Means Committee and knows the Hill well. And then you need to have a sense of the interest groups and also a sense of the news organizations and their routines. In the area of communications, there's not as much of this variety of 5 types of knowledge as there are in some of the other areas. They are They are weak in terms of how many of them know a White House well. While there is knowledge around the other parts of the White House, and the communications area is one area where they have less of it. But I think they understand that, and they have brought in people for at least a short period of time who can help in that area. Karen Hughes has brought in Margaret Tutwiler, who worked for James Baker and in the White House and the State Department as well, who has a very good sense of Washington and how it works, and she's going to work in the White House for around 6 months to help them get going. And in most areas, they have seemed to have gotten off in, as far as the press area is concerned, to a pretty good start. Ari Fleischer has made efforts to find out from news organizations what kinds of meetings they want with the press secretary. During the transition, he had his gaggle, that morning session he did by phone, and he had talked with reporters about continuing that, and they said they didn't want that they wanted that to be in person, and so he accommodated their interest there. Their startup was pretty good, except for there were a few glitches that dealt with sort of the infrastructure. The phones had trouble. They had trouble getting the phones to work in the press area. They had the computers had been taken out by the archives and stripped of their data, and their programs left, and those computers didn't come back until early in the week, so they couldn't get started with a smooth start as they wanted right at the beginning, because the White House has to pump out a lot of paper, and in the first couple of days they had trouble doing that. But those were very, very minor kinds of things. And the substantive things, you have people who are listening. The press people that on the Bush team are people who are listening and trying to understand what it is they need to do to accommodate the interests of news organizations, and but also at the same time making sure that they serve their president well. Even though a press secretary has 3 constituents, the president, news organizations, and White House staff, in spite of that, he has one boss, and that's something that they always have to remember. And I think that you'll see that has been the case, and that Fleischer and the others have made a very good start in trying to accommodate the interests of all.
Our guests will be happy to take questions. No. Mr. Ray?
What role did James Baker play in George W.'s appointments, considering his great help with the Florida mess?
Yeah.
I don't have an answer to that. I don't think we know the details yet about when appointments, especially if you're talking about cabinet appointments, when in fact those were made. I don't know yet.
What do you know about Governor Keating, who was rumored to be the shoe-in for Attorney General?
Just what I read in the papers.
I know more.
Not
I know
much.
the Lieutenant Governor very well, and we had some
Right.
good talks.
Yeah.
They called for help.
I don't have an answer to that about either why Tom Ridge was passed over or why Governor Keating was passed over. I mean, there have been some stories, nothing in particular.
But James Baker gave such a lot of help in Florida from what I hear. I would hope that I'm sure his input
Well, one thing that I
played a key
think,
role.
well, I don't think any of us know exactly what he did behind the scenes, but I think one thing that was good about the transition team was that, and is often the case in the past, is that transitions are difficult when you don't make the smooth movement from the campaign to the transition. And one way to avoid that problem is to have 2 tracks working. One group of people whose exclusive job is to work on the transition. And in this case, Clay Johnson, and Clay will tell you in person that he's not a political person. His job has always been to make the trains run on time. He hasn't been a person who has been committed to getting George Bush elected. He doesn't know how to do that. He's a businessman. And I think one of the advantages of that sort of operation is that it allows you to keep focused on what you need to keep focused on while the other guys are getting the person elected. And in this case, Secretary Baker played a very important role in what we would consider to be the getting the guy elected part. He may not have played a very big role in the transition planning simply because he was spending so much time in the other part. But the fact of the matter is you'll have to ask Secretary Baker that. Yes, I'm sure you will. Any others? Yes, in the back.
I have a question for John George. You spoke for a while about the necessity of the Bush administration to compromise on policy positions. How would you compare that to the triangulation that Dick Morris and Bill Clinton came up with?
Boy, that's a tough one. I think the approach is going to be different. I mean, my sense is, and it's now stronger, that George W. Bush is a conservative in ways that are different from his father, and that those principles are very strong with him. I think that's different from the triangulation that went on in the Clinton administration. The difficulty I think he's going to have is deciding exactly where to make those compromises. I mean, there's already some movement in terms of education about whether, in fact, he will insist upon a voucher provision in the education part of his program. My sense, at least from the media, is that he's begun to back off a little bit on that. But the question will be, I mean, how far will he back off without, in his sense, compromising those principles? You know, and that's why I think the political calculation here is going to be very, very important. And I think also he's developed from what I can tell, very positive relationships across the aisle with members of Congress over the past couple of weeks. Now, how long can that, quote, charm offensive continue, and how effective, will it be? I don't know. But in other words, what I'm trying to say is I think he's sticking to his principles so far. He's going to have to move. He probably knows he's going to have to move, but the key decision will be at what point, he just makes those decisions about where to strike an agreement with Congress.
Martha?
He's
Bill?
dealing with he's dealing with Republican Congress, and so I think that's going to make it a lot easier for him. It's not dealing with a split Congress as Clinton was when he was talking with Morris.
Bill, you have anything that you'd like to contribute on this particular issue?
No.
Yeah.
That vandalism that we heard about, was it as extensive as it sounded? And will they sabotage things during the year?
Well, Martha?
Yeah.
Martha was there all week this past week, in the building.
Yeah, I don't think we really know what the extent of it was. It was blown up as a big story, and then the White House has really been walking back on it. Ari Fleischer said that they were cataloging. There was somebody who was cataloging what damage was done, and then it turned out, well, somebody was keeping it in their head. And now people really can't come up with instances of it. But I think what reporters are going to do, they're going to track that down. But I think in a way, the thing to really look at was the handoff from the Clinton administration to the Bush administration. I think that what really characterized it was cooperation. Clinton asked for the resignations of all of the people, the political appointees he had, and then if people didn't give their resignation in, then they were fired on the 19th. In addition to that, John Podesta in November sent out 2 memoranda to people in agencies and departments and asked them to put together information on the jobs in their departments, on issues and whatever problems there were, so they could hand that over to the new people. And then I know in the press area, the Bush people had been coming in for a couple of weeks, and Jake Seward, who was the press secretary for Clinton at the end, and others were providing them with information. So that, I think, is what really was the story there, that they really were making efforts to provide a good handoff, rather than, you know, what got the attention there were the W's. I guess there were some people who took W's off of the keyboards, and then they taped them. This is in the old executive office building. It was not in the West Wing. And they taped them to the tops of the doors, and the doors they're 12 feet high, so it was a way up. But I don't know. It looks pretty isolated, really.
Bill?
Some theft is traditional. In the OEOB, Executive Office Building, the bronze doorknobs, the building from the 1870s, they're very, very elaborate with the seal of the Union on them. There's a standing order with the foundry in Leesburg. Every administration changes for so many new doorknobs because they're unscrewed and taken away to be made into bookends. That's been going on for years and years.
And the same is true of Air Force One. There's a lot of talk about memorabilia from Air Force One appearing on eBay and stuff like that, but that's very common, and it is not necessarily the president or his personal staff, but it is everybody who rides in the plane tries to walk off with something, and that's just the way it is.
Question for Martha. In removing some of these computers, how important is it to maintain a consistent database that goes from one administration to the other? Because I think you could lose some
Well,
continuity.
you know, what happens is, because of the Presidential Records Act, the information all goes to the Presidential Library. So all of their email system was shut down on Thursday, was the last time they could get into it, and then the archives took over all of their email. So that when people came in, actually what the press office looked like, over the weekend, the painters had come in and they painted everything. They put down new carpeting, and of course they had to move stuff out. And so in the press area, in an area where you'd normally see, I don't know, say 7, you know, maybe 6 or 7 desks, you know, there were 2, and then you had, you know, phones sitting on chairs and that sort of thing. So you really, you didn't have too much there at the beginning. But there's no paper there. I mean, look at the shelves in Ari Fleischer's office. There are public papers of the president that press secretaries have at one wall, and they have 3 televisions. That stuff was there, and there was nothing else. Because information does not pass from one administration to another. It becomes the records of that administration and then goes into the library, and then we as scholars and you too can request information coming from that administration, and that's the only way it can be done. Now there are some people who might copy stuff and give it to the new people, some of the materials, if that is just general material about the operations of the office. In the legal counsel's office, or the counsel's office, there are opinions from the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, advisory opinions, and then there are uses of the War Powers Act and the letters that accompany it, information on presidential disability and letters that deal with that as well. And the NSC has some information, crisis information, going back into earlier administrations. But otherwise, it's pretty empty. And so that's why it's so important for them to be able to come in and talk to people in the period beforehand, which they've done, and talk to their predecessors. What happened with the Clinton people, since they were appointed only 5 days before they came in, they didn't have that opportunity. All they had to do was the opportunity to move. And once you get there, it's really pretty difficult to learn. So in our case, with our materials went very early to both the Gore and the Bush people, so they could read them, and they include interviews with people who were in 7 offices that were critical to a good start. Actually, most of the ones that John talked about, and they could read all of that stuff at an earlier point. and I know did in the case of the press office. Not only did Ari Fleischer read stuff, but also other people did as well. They were appointed early enough that they had the time to do it, and they made use of it. And I think that's true in most administrations. People would make use of the materials if they had the time. And in this administration, they did appoint people sufficiently early that they could read the stuff.
Well, one thing you should remember from my talk, if you were here in November, was that Americans do not transfer power the way you would normally think it ought to be transferred. And one of the really important elements, characteristics of that bizarre system of transfer that we use is that the building is empty and there is no paper. And that's in fact why the reports that we've done for the Bush team and for the Gore team turned out to be so valuable, because it provided them with paper about the jobs they were holding or about to hold that they simply wouldn't have gotten if they'd walked into the building, because it's just, there's no institutional memory there.
How does this dovetail with record keeping and databases in the departments and agencies? I mean, obviously, they have a permanent sort of ongoing staff, so things are not stripped. Is a lot of the White House material, or any of it, duplicated in those agencies so that cabinet members and agency heads could go in and find current information?
There's information in the Office of Management and Budget about policy. That becomes an important type of institutional memory. But it would not be White House file information, but that goes into the White House central files. But a lot of the department material would go as well if it's somehow as a record that it relates to the White House. But the departments, the secretaries pulled together a lot of information for their successors. Each of them, did what Podesta asked, and Donna Shalala put together in her book. She made hers one that dealt with how do you get a hold of the budget, what systems are there in place, and how do you manage the place. She said that was her emphasis, and the information about units. What units from the office, she said she had those as appendices. She focused on the management kinds of issues. But it is difficult to get the paper from the past, I think, even at the departmental level.
Yes, I would like to know, when Linda Chavez, the situation with her, how do you think President Bush handled that situation as one of his first challenges? Do you think she was a sacrificial lamb?
You want to take that one?
Yeah, both I think that. I think that what happened is that she was not forthcoming. The way in which they dealt with it is usually there are a whole bunch of forms that people have to fill out, starting with the White House personal data statement, which had 43 questions in the Clinton White House that asked whether you ever had a lawn service, a babysitter, everything, trying to get at that question of whether you'd not paid taxes for somebody. Of FBI form. And then the full field investigation, the financial disclosure statements, all of those, get really into what kinds of things that you might have that would be a problem. What they did, because they just didn't have as much time as has been true in the past, they allowed people to go forward before some of these forms were filled out, before the full FBI and field investigation was done. And what they basically had to tell them was, look, we want you to be honest with us and tell us up front what problems you have, and then we can work with you on what kind of appointment you get. And she didn't do that. And so what happens if she was not honest with them, and she admitted that she was not as forthcoming as she should have been, then she was on her own. And I think they left her on her own, and I think people felt rightly so, and it was a very good message for other people who are to come along in the process, that you've got to, right at that initial stage, you have to be forthcoming, that it's unfair to, it's going to be unfair to the administration to do otherwise. So I think they handled it very well.
Any other questions? Ms. DeVitz?
How does does the president start the day as far as getting the news that's happened overnight around the world? Do we see Laura Bush reading the newspaper to him over his bowl of cereal, or does he go straight to the office and then someone there helps him to grasp just the important things of the day so he can go forward with his work, or what?
This is actually something that Martha knows quite a bit about. One of the things we've been doing is trying
to
to track out what the meeting schedule and routine of the White House is, because it's one of the things that people didn't know about. So, Martha, you want to tell them about
He gets up at 5:45. It said that he gets up at 5:45, and he's been working out on a treadmill. But he hasn't started. There's a jogging track that's out on this, that goes around the driveway in the south lawn area. But he's been working out on a treadmill, and he gets to the office about 7:15, which I think his father got there around 7. And sometimes what his father used to do was duck in as he was going along the colonnade. He would going into to the West Wing area. He would sometimes duck in and talk to reporters. And in Bush's case, the son, he comes in about 7:15 or 7:30 and gets a briefing, on national security briefing, and that's how he starts out the day.
From whom does that come?
Well, that he's going to get from his national security advisor, and that's and then you have CIA intelligence information, as well as information that comes from defense and from state. And he's going to have a weekly briefing, a session with Cole and Powell. There was some stuff that they talked about today that came up with what kinds of meetings. But his day, actually, last week, what they had been doing is they had been establishing a window if he would start events at about 9 or 9:30 and go to about 2 or 3. And that worked out very well for news organizations because they could get their stories done before the evening news. And this week he's been going longer. Today, for example, I think he had his first meeting that was a public session that was about 9:15 or 9:30, and then his last one was about 5:30. And he had all of those events were quite public. It seems to me that he's had much more. Many more photo opportunities than Clinton did in the early months. And what they've done is they've had one opportunity a day where reporters get a chance to ask him questions. And sometimes when they try at every session to ask questions, and he'll say, once a day. And so he's been answering questions once a day, which has been satisfying for them.
Is there anyone tutoring him, since there's been so much said about that he does not have as much foreign experience as his father did and other people? Is there anyone sort of tutoring him along the way to bring?
Well, he has a very experienced team, and if you think he's getting into the office and getting a national security briefing at 7:30 in the morning, then you have to step back, walk back. When is it that the person who is briefing him gets into the White House and finds out what's happened overnight? So you can start thinking about, there are a lot of people who are working behind the scenes to orchestrate that meeting at which he's being briefed at 7:30 in the morning, and it starts with the National Security Advisor and the National Security Council and their apparatus. And then behind that is all the security apparatus of the United States and all the military and diplomatic apparatus, who are all preparing materials for her to be briefed before she goes in to brief the president. And it goes backwards and backwards. In the back.
Yes. What role do you expect the Baker Institute to have with the new administration in foreign policy arena?
I'm going to let you ask that of Ambassador Derision. We have a very set answer for that. If you're asking, is he putting his house on the market for sale, I can tell you that our response is that none of us have seen his house go on the market. Well, the Institute is playing the role that it's always played, which is that it is pursuing a range of issues that it finds important, whether they're trade with China and international energy security and international terrorism and the Middle East, and basically those issues, and we're continuing to do those. And we're continuing to inform the public about those issues, including the administration. Last question.
I'm very interested in whether, along with the furniture and the bookshelves and all, is there associated with the White House a standard flow of incoming information? For instance, publications, newspapers, political journals, journals from around the world, book selection. Is there some place in the White House where these things just automatically come, or is it simply a matter of what the president wants to order and subscribe to?
Probably that, but of course there's the Library of Congress to feed on, but then there's the library in the OEO, Old Executive Office Building. The library in the White House is more of a show library downstairs, but there's a regular library in the Old Executive Office Building with journals and newspapers and publications and such as that.
I suppose practically every publication would automatically put the White House on its mailing list, but the question is, what happens at the other end? Do they receive it? Are they interested? Do people look at it? Or
I don't know.
Well, I can give you Martha and I have been the past president of the Presidency Research Group, which is a small organization worldwide of scholars on the American presidency. And we have a newsletter on the American presidency called PRG Reports. And we gave a subscription to the White House. And when that subscription lapsed, the White House called us up. They wanted to know where their subscription was. So not only is it people paying attention to it, but they're actually reading it. So I think there's a wide variety of information that, they want to know what they need to know, and so they're interested in pursuing that information. Martha.
In addition to having, the newspapers come in a variety of ways, because you have newspapers that are going to, each of the senior staff are going to get newspapers at their door or in their car. And so they will have read, say Mike McCurry, when he came in as press secretary, he had read the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times. He had listened to BBC, the morning edition, and then the Monitor News. And all of those before he came in by 7 o'clock.
You mentioned Washington Times.
Well, he sometimes would get that from a neighbor, he said, if he was up early enough. Then the president does have a regular series of papers that he receives. But around the White House, one of the most important sources of information, of news clips, is a news summary that started in the Nixon administration, where they had a group of people who would work on getting together a group of newspapers. In the Bush administration, there were 45 newspapers. There were regionals and locals that they got. And what they would do, that is a 24-hour operation. And it continues. In the Clinton administration, it was 24 hours as well. And they brought in volunteers, where the volunteers come in about 4:30 or 5 in the morning and start clipping the papers. And there's a person who would work overnight. He would come in at about, I think he said he came in about 8 o'clock, and he would stay through to the time when it was delivered. So they would cut the clips, and then in the Clinton administration, and then Xerox them and put them together, and it was about that thick. And it went to all of the top senior staff. And so they read that, the president read that as well. So that way they would get regionals. But in the Bush administration, they got the hard copies of the papers. And in the Clinton administration, by then, you can get you get most of these papers online and go through it that way. So they did a combination of it. They did a lot of the internet, but also getting hard copies as well, but using the volunteers.
I think that's what we're going to stop here, since it's near 9 o'clock. But let me suggest to you, we've brought these in. Martha's brought down the briefing book so you can see what the White House 2001 project has been doing. Feel free to come up and look at them. They're exactly what the transition team has seen.
Can we